Hello, welcome back to another interview reading for Final Fantasy XIV. This time a bit more about 8.0 and the future from a perspective of PCGamesN and PCGamesN's author Ken Alsop. We looked at one of their recent interviews actually from Gamescom, and it was quite interesting actually. We learned quite a lot about the future, but there is more to be said as we talk about how the MMORPG is expanding into the future and sort of the concept of certain characters. So for anybody who hasn't done Dawntrail and is not wanting any, minor spoilers to that, this probably won't be for you, but it doesn't go into too much detail as you would expect. So Ken Alsop then, obviously this article is linked in the description of a video. Go give it some love. All rights belong to them. I'm just reading it out. But they sat down at Gamescom and had a bit more of an interview, and we're getting drip fed across all sorts of different media, all sorts of interviews from both Gamescom and recently PAX West. This one from Gamescom then published a day ago today at the time of recording this. It says Final Fantasy XIV game director Naoki Yoshida says we'll have plenty of chances to show off our strength in the MMO's upcoming stories, but warns that you might have to do some reading. Okay, they say our Warrior of Light was supposed to be on vacation in Dawntrail, and while that didn't pan out quite as we hoped, we still took more of a backseat to give the characters around us a chance to step up and grow. Patches 7.2 and 3 make it increasingly clear that approach won't be possible moving forward. However, so they sat down with Yoshi P at Gamescom to discuss becoming the hero again, solving puzzles and Dawntrail's focus on family. So of course, if you know in 7.3 there was a certain moment in the MSQ where there is a certain amount of puzzle solving, even though that puzzle solving is quite basic and quite simple. It'll be interesting to see the reaction to that content in the way that they develop things further. So let's go to our first part of this. It says, as well as investigating his plans to address difficulty in a new way, Jamie also asked Yoshida about some of the more story-led aspects of the recent Final Fantasy XIV updates and whether they're similarly indicative of a shift in direction for the MMORPG. Without getting into specific spoilers, they say there's a climactic moment in 7.3 that puts you right in the center of the action. It definitely got them cheering, they say, and they saw a similar response from the many people they watched experience it in their own playthroughs. They say, is this approach something the team wants to keep doing? Yoshi P says, when it comes to expressing the unique role of the player as the hero, and in order to showcase really cool cutscenes and sequences where we can provide a real hero's experience and showcase the strength of the hero, we want to put more focus on this moving forward. Interesting. So this was done via the Square Enix translator. They say part of the joy of 7.3's most triumphant action sequence is that you get a custom animation based on your job. It's not the only time in the patch that matters either. The new dungeon separates players out during the boss fight and hands them different combat tasks based on their role. Healers must cleanse a doom debuff, tanks have to interrupt a dangerous enemy move, and DPS players need to destroy a machine causing constant damage. Text they say. Yoshi P says, quote, within the MSQ we can't always provide a unique expression for the jobs in every patch, but when it comes to using the jobs in battle content and bringing out more of that uniqueness of each job, we are working on a big update, end quote. Interesting. They continue here. Before Dawntrail even launched, Yoshi P had teased that he wanted to counteract class homogenization in an overhaul that was planned for 8.0. As for what that will look like, they continue, he explains that, quote, people might think of it as an expansion of the system that we have in the game. So the players who already like the way things are can feel at ease that nothing is going to change for their experience. But we are trying to do something new on top of what we already have, end quote. So there are many ways to kind of take this. Again, this sort of ambiguous, sort of vague response is the thing that's getting a lot of people kind of speculating, both negatively and positively, but more often than not, the community does like to read things like this and expect the worst, myself included. And, we're all guilty of this, and we go, less changes, more of the same is the kind of impression I'm getting from this, just with an added thing on top. Job design is really something that seems to be quite key in a lot of the feedback that you can clearly see if you look at the forums or Reddit or wherever you look, social media. A lot of people would like the job identity given back or accelerated for some cases to specific jobs, right? They want to feel like there's a reason for them to play a summoner. They want to feel that epic feeling of playing a summoner and have the DPS for that. But at the same time, reading this here, it does make me question things. However, they said they wanted to counteract class homogenization, right? Let's think about this again. People might think of it as an expansion of the system we have in the game. So the players already like the way things are, can feel at ease that nothing is going to change for their experience. We're trying to do something new on top of what we already have. Yeah, it's honestly, I think they should just come out and say what they're planning. I know that this is the sort of thing you do in Gamescom, in FanFest and things, but this kind of vague response is worrying. I don't know. It's hard not to play devil's advocate and guess that this is just, just a completely different system. Maybe like the attribute system that people were talking about, theoretically, in addition to what we already have. Yeah, we could speculate about this for the next 30 minutes, but let's not. Let's continue. But take that as you will. That was the direct quote. They say, Yoshida says he's unable to share more on this point in time, and I doubt we'll get much news on the matter until FanFest 2026. But he re-emphasizes, quote, in terms of the individuality of each job and also showcasing the player character to the fullest in terms of how they are the hero of the game, we want to continue placing importance on both of these aspects moving forward, end quote. They say, if you were among those frustrated by the more backbench role in Dawntrail's MSQ, that'll likely come as welcome news. Yeah, I think a lot of people that I've talked to either have the perspective of disliking the storyline for that exact reason, or the involvement of characters such as the Scions that didn't really seem to have much reason to have involvement, or at least less involvement than they probably should have, and it feels like there were certainly elements of the storyline that could have been embellished more that they teased, and then you kind of, I don't know, it kind of let go, especially with Kryle's storyline, I think would be my example of where that dropped off. I wanted more of that, and it kind of teased a storyline I wanted to learn more about, which presumably will be in the next expansion or the next one after that, right? Depending on when Mericidia happens. If it's not the next expansion, then the one after, right? Yeah, it's a long time to wait to have those sorts of things sort of answered. And, there's the bigger storyline of moving between different shards, right, with the 13th. And then we have, obviously, interdimensional travel and all that stuff with the key. There's a lot to look forward to. But in terms of, the job, it says in terms of individuality of each job and also showcasing the player character, the individuality of each job. How do you keep individuality to a job by keeping the system the same? That is my question. How do you, do we have individuality, if I could speak, of each job currently? I would argue not very much. I don't know how they could build on that, but retaining it is something I think that needs to be expanded on. We have so many questions. This side of FanFest, it's so difficult not to be cynical and then read something like this and go, I wonder if it is going to be this simple. Are we expecting there to be not really anything expanded on the job system? Are they actually going to add something new and exciting? But, we'll come back after the FanFest, and I'm sure we'll have a completely different opinion. Hopefully, right? Fingers crossed. I have a lot of faith, quite honestly. But, it probably would give a lot more marketing towards people keeping playing the game and coming back, right? If they were to have a little sneak peek or a little mention of what might be the direction they're going with this, But again, like Ken wrote here, we're probably not going to get anything until 2026, which kind of sucks, honestly. I kind of want to know now. I need to know now. But I'm sure a lot of you feel the same way. It's cool that we're going to be the main character again then. I personally think that that's a cool idea. I would like to be the main character again. It's my story, you know. Another highlight of patch 7.3, they say, is the sequence where the Warrior of Light and their companions investigate an old research lab. They say, I'll steal clear of the narrative spoilers, but it's an extended section featuring some light puzzle elements that require studying the environment, talking to various NPCs, and putting together the pieces to solve. While it's not quite blueprints in terms of complexity, they say, it's a refreshing change of pace that puts you in the thick of proceedings as the player, instead of feeling like you're just being dragged along while the characters around you talk to each other. I got exactly the same feeling out of that, personally. Yeah, I actually really enjoyed the puzzle sequences. Some people did not like them. I think that sort of gameplay could really work for another piece of content that hasn't been developed. Maybe like, I mean, we saw a little bit about it in the variant modes, you know, with the choice of which path, and then each path branching off depending on your choices, and if you could solve a puzzle or not, resulting in achievements and things. I think that kind of content is really best suited to this. It does make me want Inspector Hildebrand to have those elements as well, the puzzle solving and things like that. That would fit really good into that type of content. But for the MSQ, I think you have a danger of slowing people down and not pleasing every single person with a piece of content like that. I could be wrong. Yoshi P says, quote, it's not necessarily the case that that kind of experience will always be incorporated into the main scenario, but if the idea is interesting and we think that it would be fun for the main scenario, then there is a possibility that we would incorporate it, end quote. He says, speaking to the player response, he notes, quote, of course, players who want to immerse themselves in the story and really experience it as much as they can found it really refreshing. On the other hand, there are also some players who just want to rush through the main scenario, right, as fast as they can, and for them this kind of element was more of a burden for them and it got in the way. But at the end of the day, the important thing is the experience of the players, and the story is part of that. So we want to take a look at what good feedback we received and what bad feedback we received, and we can look at making the best of all the feedback in order to create something new, end quote. Exactly, right? This is my point. There are certain people who want to get to the content that is locked behind the MSQ, be that the extreme trial of that patch, right? You've got to go do the normal mode, which is locked in the actual story, before you could talk to the Wandering Minstrel to do the extreme. There are parts of me that go, you know, tough, go and enjoy the storyline, but that's also the part of me that enjoys the storyline regardless, you know, of what situation we're in. I watch the cutscenes, but there are many people who do not, right? So at the end of the day, it's striking a balance, and I think the best balance is to make something new with that idea, similar to how they were experimenting with, you know, back in Stormblood, with the idea of different cutscene technologies and things like that with the Namazu Beast tribe. A lot of people forget a lot of the things we have in the cutscenes after Stormblood were primarily, you know, the responsibility of trying things out in content that isn't the main storyline. And this time around, I think they've done the flip side. They've come up with a really cool idea of puzzles and, you know, maybe even making them more advanced than they currently are. It's the sort of content that is ideal for anything other than the main storyline. As a side quest, as an inspector series, like a detective series, I would play the crap out of that. I would love that personally. So we'll have to see what happens. But nothing is added to this game that is wasted, in my opinion. Look at Diadem, how many times that was recycled and then we got Eureka out of it and things like that, right? There are plenty of pieces of content that they throw the pasta at the wall and see when it sticks, and when it does stick, they recycle those elements into something based on that feedback. And I think the same's going to happen here. Really cool. They say, unfortunately, if you're a story skipper, that might cause some small progress blockers. Yoshi P says they usually would skip all of the text just to get to the end of the MSQ, but this time around they actually need to read the text in order to clear that portion. He says it's difficult for us to tweak it in such a way that it's accommodating for the players who really want to immerse themselves and enjoy it as much as they can, and also for those players who just want to rush through everything because they want the latest extreme trial as fast as possible. They say, the interviewer says, with Dawntrail now over, there's one more question. Who ended up as Yoshida's favorite character? Yoshi P says, quote, we really put a lot of hard effort and work to make sure that all of the characters' stories would reach their completion in 7.3. He says, okay. And because of all that effort and attention, it's very difficult if you ask me to choose just one as my favorite. Despite that, he thinks for a while and then points to the expansion's youngest star, Galulja. They say, note that there will naturally be some light story spoilers here. All right. Quote, when we look at Galulja, he's still a child, Yoshida explains. Out of all of the characters that we've depicted in Final Fantasy XIV, I think he would be the youngest in terms of age. But even though he's a child, he has a very strong foundation and strong standing. But at the same time, he's also malleable, as it were. I think that goes without saying because he is a child. But when it came to depicting the trajectory of his emotions, I think that one area we did that really stands out. Another example is Lamati and Kona, right? Kona, I think you'd pronounce that from a story. I always call him Koana for some reason, but it's Kona. Right, taking him in as a part of the family. Showing that link and bond of them becoming family was another area that stood out. In a similar regard, I could also bring up the example of Kafkiwa and Erenville and their bond together as family as well. With those family bonds now forged, it looks like we're getting ready to set off to pastures anew. Quite where that'll be remains to be seen. And they say here, the frozen waters of Blindfrost in Offard's north. Mericidia, perhaps? Your guess is as good as mine, but I'll make sure to pack your best combat gear for the trip. Very cool. Firstly, great article. It's always nice to hear more from PCGamesN. They have some really good, absolute bangers of interviews, quite honestly. This will be linked in the description. Go support them. Also, interesting to point out that he picks Galulja, kind of like a new beginning sort of character. I wonder if we'll see more of that character past Dawntrail, because that could be quite an evolution. Like maybe like a year or two passes, maybe something happens and then we see this character grow. It remains to be seen like who will get Scion sort of treatment in terms of the storyline and who will not. Personally, my money at first was on Sven, but I guess that's not going to happen, right? That's who I would personally want to see as a Scion, but I guess Erenville might end up being more of a permanent thing. I do think, like, as a reflection then on this article and the responses, making the main storyline as fluid as possible, yet not cutting corners just because of a subset of a community that want to skip through it is important, but at the same time, I can see that it kind of has to be one of those toss-ups. You either continue with your main storyline being required as a gateway for all of the major content that people need to unlock, right? Or you separate it like you did with the Savage tier, where you make it so that the storyline branches off at a certain point, maybe at like level 93 or whatever, or 103 or whatever it might be, yeah? In the future, maybe they'll be like, hey, there's a storyline that will unlock the trial or whatever. But then if you didn't have the trial as part of the MSQ, would it really have the same gravitas if you didn't have that, you know, life-risking situation where you're encountering the normal mode of a fight? I think you need that sort of threat. Otherwise, the storyline would just be quite dull, and it would just be cutscenes. So, I don't know. It's a toss-up, isn't it? I do think the idea of this, like, investigatory puzzle-solving thing has a place in the game, but I also think it's probably not in the MSQ. Wonderful read once more. It seems to be even more vague and ambiguous with 8.0 than it was before, quite honestly. I really just wish that we could sit down with Yoshi P and get just a definitive answer. Or A, are we getting levels again? Is it going to go to like 110? Or are we just going to get attribute points to some other system. They don't have to explain what the system is. I just want to know if we're getting levels or not, because depending on if we get levels or not is depending on how far you can push the battle system, at least in my mind. So anyway, let me know what you think about this. What would you prefer? We've talked about this before, but it seems to be an ever-changing discussion, and I'm always excited to see what other people think. Anyway, once again, thanks to Ken Alsop and, of course, the PCGamesN website here for publishing these things for us to read through. Link in the description. Much love. Enjoy the rest of your day. More videos on the way as we cover everything to do with this game, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.